Are we recording, Alexa? Okay. All right, guys. Hi and welcome. I'll commence my introduction of our author, Michelle Dowd, with a brief introduction of her work I've copied from the About section of her website before introducing her latest book and the topic of our discussion, Forager, in my own words. Michelle Dowd is a journalism professor and contributor to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Book Review, the Alpinist, Catapult, and other national publications. She's Faculty Lecturer of the Year for 2022 at Chaffey College, where she founded the award-winning literary journal and creative collective, the Chaffey Review. She advises student media and teaches poetry and critical thinking in the California Institute for Men and Women in Chino. She has been recognized as a Long Reads top 5 for her article on the relationship between environmentalism and hope in The Alpinist, nominated twice for the Pushcart Prize, and profiled on the second season of Sincerely X, a TED production for stories too risky, painful, or controversial to be shared on the stage. Her popular Modern Love column in the New York Times inspired a book contract. Her latest work, Forager, is a captivating and at times disturbing recollection of a youth spent immersed in the wilds of Angels National Forest, where she lived in a compound which was the headquarters for a Christian cult founded by her grandfather called The Field. Central to the cult's beliefs and practices was preparation for an imminent apocalypse. In order to survive this apocalypse and ascend to a heaven on the mountain, adherents to The Field were immersed in a survivalist mentality where they were taught everything from paramilitary tactics to, as the title of the book suggests, foraging. It is without doubt that foraging Southern California's rich plant life became Michelle's dearest takeaway and a lifelong foundation for how to autonomously navigate the world. The book unfolds at a furious pace, and though it is rich with details and niche information about plant and animal life, it never ever feels unapproachable or overwhelming. It is a magnificently accessible text that manages to rise above moral, philosophical, and textual oversimplification. The complexity of this work lies in reconciling Michelle's wondrous awareness of nature, instilled in her primarily by her mother, who is considered an unparalleled naturalist in the Angels National Park Service, while simultaneously being held ideologically and physically captive by her family. Michelle's mother remarked, quote, "Go outside, look around, but never touch wild things if you want them to thrive." This reverent approach to the natural world is one I'm sure shared by most conservationists and underscores the deep respect Michelle's mother holds for wildness. In the book, Michelle recounts how her mother brought home a baby owl that had left its nest too early. She nursed it to health and released it before park rangers could intercede in its rehabilitation or compromise its wildness. And yet her mother, as did The Field, considered human wildness, our most natural physical and sensual behaviors, to be abominable, forcing strict gender hierarchy and systematic abuse in order to control its members. Luckily, Michelle was able to fly the nest on her own and has been rehabilitating herself from the traumas living in the confines of The Field ever since. So today we're incredibly lucky to have her with us to discuss this exceptional work. Please give a welcoming applause for our author, Michelle Dowd.
Thank you, Nisar. That was beautiful.
Oh, thank you very much.
I'm impressed by your writing, honestly.
Oh, no, you're very sweet. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
So for those of us who haven't read Forager, I'd like to give a little brief synopsis of how the book is organized, because the organization of the book is central to a lot of the writing. As the title suggests, the book is organized around foraging secrets, foraging notes, little tips and tricks, and a lot of plant life, information about plant life in Southern California. So each chapter is actually pinpointed at the beginning, at the top, with a little description of a plant that Michelle knows about, and its medicinal and or its edible purposes. The first question I have for you is, at what point did this organizational technique kind of come into play? Because it seems so central not only to the book, but also the title.
So I did not have a specific book in mind when I was approached by agents after the Modern Love column. And when I was approached, I knew, because I'm a writing teacher, that you can't just like spill your guts in a memoir, that you need to have structure. And I also hadn't told this story publicly. And I kept thinking to myself, I need a takeaway that has some degree of hope, but I didn't want to write a purely inspirational story. So I think it took me all of maybe a week or two to brainstorm and to say, do I have something somewhat unique to say? And can there be something that people who have not been raised in, hierarchical structures like high control religion, that they could relate to? And so I thought, well, these plants, because this, and my editor at the time, well, the book was not yet quite bought. So my agent said, I don't know. I think maybe you should have animals in there. And I said, well, we didn't eat the animals in that way. And I really like the idea that these chapters are centered around what we consumed because I was consuming words. Oh, nice. I was consuming words, like foraging for words. And that's was finding the narrative that I needed to find my way out. But the food itself, I thought was really important too. And that came from the land itself. So that was very early on. I didn't start the book until I had that.
Gotcha. And yeah, a lot of the plants are things that Michelle ate back then. Perhaps you've been eating now some of
Yeah.
them. You're
Yeah.
still foraging.
Yeah, sometimes.
Okay, that's awesome.
Just not the only way I eat.
No, the only way you eat these days. I gotcha. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And how much of it was from recollection, or even like your continued practice of foraging? The information. How much of it did you have to like reference, maybe a foraging book or your notes from childhood?
So I was incredibly lucky about two things. Well, probably many things with the book, but on this particular subject is during COVID, I went up to the mountain where I was raised, which I do talk a little bit about in the epilogue, and I was able to get my mom's notes
Oh.
that she had left there because she had something called pulmonary fibrosis, which meant that she could no longer go to high altitude. So she had donated all of her things to the field, and she moved to the desert for her last days. And she did not, I think, even think about giving anything to her children. That just
Yeah.
wasn't her mindset. But when I went up there, now technically I borrowed these things. I just haven't returned them yet. But I got all my mom's notes, her books, the things that she used. And so it was way better than having the books because I had all her writings
Yeah.
and they were the same things that she had taught me by example. So that was a huge windfall. And then I also unearthed a box of my own writings from the Sears catalog to other writings that I had as a young teenager and all the way up until 17. And I was able to use my notes from that as well.
Okay, amazing. So you had a collection basically of information that you could
Absolutely.
reference. Oh, that's incredible. Now, I think foraging as a theme, as an idea that's very central to the book is sort of the central conundrum, right? Because in a way, foraging is what gave you freedom, but the only way you could learn to forage to such a exact degree is because of your mother, who kind of kept you captive, for lack of a better word. Maybe that is the correct word. So I guess the question that I'd really like to get to, just so I don't take away any time from the audience if they have questions, is how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile getting this knowledge, which I would just like to point out, I feel like 99% of us don't have. We'd be very lucky to have this knowledge. And I feel like that I learned a lot from this book, and most of us would be very lucky to have such an education, just not at the cost in which you received it. So the book is obviously a meditation on how you reconcile that, but have you any thoughts that you could give to us about how you deal with how you derive this knowledge and how you use it today?
Well, first, I think that any of us with trauma and pain, and everyone has had incidents in their life, whether they are capital T trauma or lower case trauma, but to hold both of those things simultaneously. So, if we have, for example, I had a medical diagnosis that kept me in the hospital for years, which was a really painful thing, especially to be kept in isolation. But I also hold that with the knowledge that that gave me the space that I needed to see myself as existing outside of the origin of my family and the field. And I think that foraging is very similar in that way, is that I can hold both of those truths to be simultaneous, which is I would not have chosen to have been raised the way I was raised. But then with any upbringing, there are nuggets of truth and wisdom and gifts. And I say near the end that even a box of darkness is a gift that we do get to hold. And I tried to even show that with the sky, that my uncle having this truly crazy idea that he could prove on the Star of Bethlehem and all the things that he thought he could do, that in the process of him trying to prove that, I got to spend a great deal of time looking at the night sky and putting together where I was in space in relation to the sky.
And you would know where you are just by reading the stars.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's the amazing thing. Or Uncle Stephen, I think.
Yes.
I don't know if you changed his name.
I did. I changed his
changed
name,
his
but
name, yeah.
yes, I'm starting to remember the names now.
Oh, okay.
Because I wrote the whole book. It was fact checked with all the original names. And
Gotcha,
so it took me a moment to remember. But yes, Uncle Stephen.
Uncle Stephen in the book is a tremendous astronomer and teaches Michelle how to read the stars and approximate, her geolocation based off the stars. Really important stuff that I feel like we don't know anymore. And I feel like, especially environmentally conscious people or people worried about ecology, I feel like that hands-on information is like super important because it actually materializes what you care about. It's not abstract and theoretical.
And we have so much light pollution. And even the mountain I grew up on has more light pollution now than it did when I was growing up. And I also want to add, because you mentioned my mom, my mom died in 2022, and I have come to believe several things about my mom that I didn't necessarily know till I did the research to write this book. And I had the great privilege and honor of being with my mom as she died and spending her last breaths with her, but also the hours leading up to that, and to some degree the months leading up. I wasn't there the whole time for months, but I was there for the whole death process. And my sisters were not able or willing to do that. And I'm very, very grateful that for whatever reason, I was able to show up for that. And I would say that one thing I've realized about my mom is that she truly was a victim of the upbringing herself, because she was born into the cult. It was her father who started it. And her mother was someone who was really negated in most ways. My grandmother was not taken seriously because she was a woman. And so my mother was the fourth child, but the first girl. And she wanted to be a man because the men were the only ones with power. And so she truly never embraced her femininity. She never really saw being a girl as having any advantages whatsoever. And so for her to try to, in a sense, beat that out of me was a way, I think, of her protecting me. I don't know. I think about the song, the Johnny Cash song, A Boy Named Sue.
Oh yeah.
And I think like mom was like, you're not gonna make it in this world, as a girl. So you're gonna like have to. And so I think that in its own way, I mean, she could not express love or affection. She couldn't use the word love. But I think that there were things that she did that I now perceive as those gifts that she gave me were loving in their own way. Not the way I would encourage anyone to express love to their children, but a way of giving me gifts that I could take with me that were really useful in navigating the rest of my life.
Absolutely. She almost seems like she has almost like a cognitive dissonance going on at all times. The scene where I think you catch her playing piano, is it?
Yeah.
So she's clearly a lover of music.
Yeah.
Clearly someone very talented. And then the way that, for those of us who haven't read it, the way that the Park Service talks about her mother as a naturalist, I think like at the end of the book, literally like one of them refers to her as like the greatest naturalist ever worked in the Park Service at Angeles National Forest. Yeah, it's amazing how incredibly scientifically literate she was. And yet she would be hyper skeptical at times, like about, I thought it was, apologize, maybe a little comical, the fossils.
Yeah.
She's like, oh, yeah, fossils are to test our faith.
Yeah.
And I thought that was quite interesting that at the same time as being very, very scientifically literate, she could be very, very skeptical.
I literally paid for her to get higher education when I was in graduate school. So later in life, I really, really wanted her to use her knowledge and go teach at a school. And she did go back to school, but she would not teach because of evolution. And she refused to in any way talk about evolution because she would not, at least she tried to say, I will never let people believe this could be true. And I tried to say to her, but she just would shut me. She literally wouldn't have this conversation. But mom, you must have passed a test where someone must have made you learn this. Can't you teach it as a theory, even if you don't believe in it? But she couldn't. She just couldn't. And she had a lot of cognitive dissonance. But going up, it was before COVID, but going up before I wrote the book and meeting this woman, Barbara, who knew her, and just like kind of the way my daughter just like showed up, like so unusual. But to go into a situation and have them be like, you couldn't have known Mrs. Dowd, she was just legendary. And to think like that woman had worked with her for all those years and never knew she had children, it was so eye-opening to me. But also I thought, yeah, exactly. Like, and it wasn't like we were grown children. We were like living with my mom.
Right.
And she just never would have occurred to her to mention that she had children at home that she needed to get home to. Or
almost like a double life in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah. She was like a secret agent of some sort.
Wow. Yeah. No, and I mean, probably other than you, the most primary character of the book, right? Is that a good way to characterize
her? I think so. Yeah. Right. And that was something that I think I uncovered as I was writing it, is that my mom was the love of my life. Like she was the one I most tried to impress and most tried to get to love me, like my whole life. And even into her death, she couldn't love me. Like she couldn't, at least she couldn't say that she loved me. And I was at peace with that by the time that happened. But that was all of last year. This is very recent.
Right, very recent.
But she wasn't able, and she did say maybe 2 weeks before she died, I can never forgive you. And my response inside is like, that's okay, mom, because I already forgave you. Like, it's okay, you know, because she needed to justify her life in some way that wasn't compatible with mine.
I'd like to open it up to the audience soon. I just have one more question about one story in the book.
Okay.
Is when I think you went to Florida. And it was
Ross Allen.
First of all, I don't know who that is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I want to add just one piece of the story.
Okay,
so one of the beautiful things and unusual things that's happened since the book came out is former members of the field who
Mhm.
I hadn't seen or heard of in just decades. Some of them, my early caregivers, young girls or young women. This one who I'm speaking of right now, her name is Lori. She contacted me. They would find me on either some sort of social media, LinkedIn. I don't know. There was so many different messages I got. And I remembered her, and I had no idea she left the field when she was only 15, but she
Uh-huh.
had taken care of me. She knew my mom when she was pregnant with me. She took care of me when I was a baby, when she was probably 12. And she had saved a lot of stuff that she had, and she'd gotten excommunicated when she was 15. It destroyed her emotionally, and she just really wanted to meet with me. And she was one of the few that I agreed to make an extra trip to a coffee shop to sit down and talk to. And she told me that and she showed up to one of my readings before that, so I'd
Uh-huh.
already seen her. And she said her husband, she had been telling her husband early on about this Ross Allen trip because she's one of the girls in the swamp. And her husband had told her, oh, no, nobody would let little girls like be out there in the middle of the night. And he said, you must be misremembering. And she said, no, I know, but I really, this happened. I just don't understand what we were doing, et cetera, et cetera. And so then when the book came out, she said, look, she's writing about it too.
Confirmation.
And it was confirmation, in which I had never heard anyone else really talk about it other than my mom.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But Ross Allen is just some sort of, I mean, you can look him up on the internet. He had a reptile farm,
Mhm.
and they turned it into kind of a minor park of some sort where people could come and look at in the South, like see alligators, crocodiles, like look at them in the swamp. But early, before he had really turned it into that, when I was just a really little girl, he was developing it. And my mom, who knows how she knew of him, because she just knew a bunch of people with animals. And so she had somehow gotten us in, and I think she really did it for herself, but because there were these other girls traveling with her, she just took us all with her. But I think she was just very unidimensional, right? So
Uh-huh.
like she is fixated on this man who's teaching her.
Yeah.
And apparently my dad was there too, but like she was fixated on Ross and asking these questions. And it just didn't occur to her that the rest of us were having a very different experience than she was.
For her, it was another educational experience about nature.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Because in the book, I think you mentioned that she blocked out that you were there at
Yeah.
all. Yeah, and she was telling the story as though you weren't there. Yeah, so they would go on these trips again for anyone who hasn't read it across America. And this is was this part of one of the trip
Yeah,
capital
we were
T
on the
trips
trip and then she got this opportunity.
to
So we were
go?
proselytizing all over the place or
Uh-huh.
trying to save people or, teaching
Right.
about our version of God.
I just kind of want to know. So, like something like educating yourself about like swamp animals. Is the idea that when the world ends, you may have to survive in a swamp?
Sure.
Okay, so it could be just one of the variables you have to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you never
Yeah.
know.
You ever know crocodiles? Yeah, because they taught you how to look at the eyes and everything like that. Oh,
Yeah.
that's very cool. Yeah. Yeah, guys. If anyone has any questions they'd like to open up to Michelle, I'd love to hand over the mic to anyone. If not, I obviously a lot more. But are you sure?
We have Mark right there. I just
Mark.
met.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, if I may really quickly just repeat the gist of the question, the gist of the question is how transgenerational, cross generational trauma is transmitted. Mark, is that the
Also known, I think, as epigenetics.
epigenetics? Yeah.
Um, so I don't know if this is ironic. My daughter, who was here briefly, who did not know I was going to be here tonight, she can't seem to bring herself to read the book, but she is a trauma therapist. She's a marriage and family therapist who specializes in trauma, and she is my oldest daughter I had when I was quite young, and she is really successful at this, very successful. She charges a lot of money to help people with trauma. And I'm not making fun of this. I think she's probably really good at what she does. She certainly doesn't treat me because that would be unethical. But I think she would tell you, I wish that she had been able to stay. She would probably tell you that my trauma has became her trauma. Like she, especially as my oldest daughter, like I had not processed what I had been through when I was pregnant with her. And my guess is, even though I was certainly a present mother who told her I loved her all the time, actually, she's a twin. So I had twins, um, fraternal twin girls. But the other one is a trauma nurse, and she works as, yeah, in ER. And I think both of them are extremely calm under pressure. And it's not the same as your mother, which I'm sorry to hear that story for her and for you. My daughters would certainly say, because they've said this to me before, that I was the most calm under pressure. And anytime I was teaching when they were little, I used to bring them into the classroom. I was a college professor by the time I was 21, and so when I had my little babies and I was, like teaching, I would bring them when they were like sick or couldn't, whatever. I'd bring them on my belly, on my back. So they grew up in college classrooms. All my kids did, and they would sit in the corner playing with cars, and they knew how to be in that space. And they would both say, like, the most extreme things could happen. We had like a bomb threat or something, and everybody's like turning off lights and there's sirens, and I'm just like, all right, everybody, now we're gonna, and I think that they witnessed the level to which I was calm under pressure, and I don't think they would consider their upbringings traumatic, but I mean, they would be able to give you a better answer to this, but I think that they truly were impacted by my trauma so much so that they know how to manage trauma. And my son has said to me that one of the things he found very comforting, and this is when he was in college. I used to go visit him on spring break, and we would hang out. And he said that, and I went through a little period where I was like, was I there enough for you? Like, did I work too much? Did I have too many kids? Was I like, did I give you what you needed? And he said, yeah, mom, I would not want to view around more. You were always like, I knew where you were. Like, if I ever needed you, you always picked up the phone. Like, I could always find you. He said, actually, what was most comforting in my childhood is I could wake up at any time of the night. It didn't matter how late it was, didn't matter how early it was, and you were always awake, and you were like painting, or you were like grading. But I think that's a trauma response too. Like, I couldn't sleep, but he didn't find that as traumatic. He found that as comforting, is that I was never in bed. And so like he could come home late as a teenager, and it's like, oh, there's mom doing this thing, or she's cooking at 2 a.m. And so I think that I just became, I think, in my early, especially motherhood years, really busy. I just like kept myself occupied in ways that my older daughter would now say that I am, but she'd say that I was a workaholic. I was just, and it wasn't like I always had to be working for money, but I always had to be doing something. And so I definitely think that there's intergenerational trauma that I have done my best to compensate for, but like I cannot say that was the mother I would have been had I not been raised the way I was raised. I might have been softer in some way.
Yeah, there's an overwhelming, I mean, fear of the world always ending. That's just a big one. One of the most horrifying for me ones is it in the book is, I guess, this notion that I guess your grandfather saw himself as like an Abrahamic figure, and that he could at any point kill you and your siblings or any blood relatives. Was there any point at which before you left the field that you let go of that fear? And I mean, obviously after you passed, that fear probably
Oh, I
went
thought my
away.
mom would do it after me.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Oh my
Yeah.
God. Wow.
Absolutely. And I my father used to use an expression a lot. I'm gonna squish you like a stink bug. And when I was really little, like I pictured him, and he would, like, my dad was definitely someone, he was in the army for a while, drafted, and he would smash bugs and like ground them down with his feet, like in a very dramatic way. And he was very clear that if we ever betrayed him, or I mean, I think if my parents ever thought that I had like premarital sex or did anything like that, like they would have thought that was grounds for honor killing.
Wow. Oh,
Yeah, I mean, it was they were very clear that we were not, that there was a limit to how much we could cross,
right.
breaking any sorts of the major, in their opinion, God given rules.
And clearly very gendered specific rules because as a part in the book where a boy, I think he chases you and like pins you to the floor, and then your mom's suggestion is, oh, give him a Snickers bar, and the idea is that you would pacify his like
Yes, and plus
bullying.
candy was really hard to get a hold of, so that was like a
Uh-huh.
real gift.
But what a weird message! It's like you're giving him a prize for that behavior.
Yeah, I wish I could say that I'm the only one who's given those kinds of messaging as
Yeah,
a young girl. I think that girls are not given that messaging now. I hope they're not.
yeah,
But yes, if you pacify, then you are less likely to get traumatized. And I think my mom really believed that it was kind of like the wild kingdom. It's like if you freeze or fawn,
yeah.
I mean, it's a fawning response, is that you are doing something to pacify so that you have time if it was serious enough to get away.
Right, right.
But you would never fight back. I for certain was raised that you would never fight back against a man, that that's like the worst thing that you could do,
That's fun.
even verbally.
Mhm. Does anyone else have a question right now?
I'm sure there was a lot of things you could have put in the book. What's probably one thing that you did include that you wish, yeah, that maybe that would add more to the story, or maybe it was a favorite of yours, and maybe the editor was like, yeah, that one, I don't know how it fits with the role.
That's a great question, and no one has ever asked me that. Um, Interestingly, the editor did not take out any stories. I was sort of just let go to write it, and they had me add an epilogue, but there was no chapters taken out, and no, the edits were like very minor. So that's interesting. I did not expect that. There are tons of things that I left out that I had on note cards that I didn't even really develop into stories. I was I edited a lot before I turned in the book because I think partly, like I said, I work as a writing teacher. And so I'm always editing people's work. So I'm taking things out. And I think I tried to leave a lot of white space in a sense of like literal white space, but like space for the reader to fill in the gaps. Nizar and I were just talking about how I just did the adaptation for screenplay. And so I wrote some scenes that I didn't get a chance to put in the book that were fun. But there's one that I don't know if it would have fit or not. It's not that traumatic. But my grandfather, when my sister Elizabeth and we have the same birthday, and so we're a year apart, and we were required when we were um, 11 and 12. Yeah, so we were turning 11 and 12 to get our hair cut. And so this is something I don't discuss really in the book, but my mom had short hair her whole life, like really, really short hair, like a boy's haircut, since before I was born. And she had the exact same haircut all the way till she died, always. And my grandfather did mandate that all the women in the field had short hair, like the men, which I think is unusual in cults. I didn't realize that until later. So everyone had these really short haircuts. And my grandfather ordered my grandmother to take us to get our hair cut. And Elizabeth and I went, and Elizabeth and I just found a picture, and there's no pictures. And I sent it to my director. I'm like, you can put this in the lookbook. And Elizabeth got her hair cut really short, and I didn't. And I had really long hair. And the woman who was cutting our hair, I said, no, I don't want to cut. And she's like, oh, that's good, honey. You just have this good hair. And so she trimmed it, and then she put these little braids in the front. And my grandfather got so angry, and he started screaming at her and, telling her she was Jezebel. But what's really interesting is nobody shaved my head after that. And I just find that really bizarre. Honestly, I don't know to this day, like why my mom didn't force me to then get the short haircut. And my younger sister had a short haircut like a boy, Becca did. And I never did ever. And I don't know why that happened. I don't know if my rebellion, I don't know. And then, but I do think I was used as an example of a horrible human. But then it's interesting that they didn't force that. So, um, I don't know. There's a lot of stories. That one I just thought of recently.
One thing I just wanted to clarify for myself was everyone given the same level of forging information that your mother gave you, or were you unique in a way with the amount of information that she relayed?
Not everyone was given that level. My mom did teach. So The people at the field would come up to the mountain on a bus, and they would stay there for periods of time, different periods of time. The men who lived with us with us because they, in some way, were not conforming to the edicts of the field as much as they should have been. So they were sent up there to do labor, kind of
Oh,
in its own way, like Siberia or something. They were sent up like to be outside and to
gulag.
be trained in harsh ways. So most people were not given the level of training, and a lot of what I got was because I was sick and couldn't always be places, and then also because I was an eavesdropper and I would sneak around and follow my mom and listen to things that I wasn't supposed to be listening to. And so I was, and reading her books when I wasn't supposed to, and doing a lot of that. And my sisters, since they weren't sick, were often at our grandmother's house or somewhere else, and they were not able to have the access that I did to our mother. But also, my mother did require, and when our grandfather died, she required everyone to quote graduate from their school to be trained in survival training. So I did meet a lot of people who, after the book came out, who told me, your mother taught me everything I know about nature. So it wouldn't be the level that I know, but I can't any everyone who mentioned my mom says, I know all the different trees because of your mom, or I know how to walk in the dark because of your mom, or I know how to recognize the sound of this particular bird. And everyone who knew her learned something about it. Like, it was impossible not to learn from her. But she did require, by the time, and it started just before me, but anyone my age or maybe for 20 years after that would have been trained to sleep out on the desert without any, and to get the siphon dew from plants, to do a urine pit. They would have been given that knowledge.
So survivalism seems to be the thing that everyone was educated about,
Right, but not all the foraging.
but not all the foraging. Was there any agricultural component? Like, did you guys grow your own food and stuff like that?
No, because so preppers are people who are on some level, like they're stockpiling weapons or water or canned goods or whatever. You're preparing. Ours was absolutely not preparing.
Uh-huh.
It was that you could be put in any situation
Right.
and you would be able to survive with nothing.
It was it's almost like a nomadic lifestyle. Like you could be in the swamps of Florida.
Yes, exactly.
The world's ending.
Yeah, and you would not be afraid,
Right.
right?
And it's because you guys were on the road so much, right? I guess
Yeah.
that would be the big part
And we
of
would
it.
go to Mexico and we'd
Yeah.
sleep in the dirt there and we'd proselytize. I don't even know. I think that I mean, that's the thing about a mercurial leader.
Yeah.
He could make up any rules he wanted anytime he wanted.
Okay.
And everyone called him grandpa. So grandpa could just decide we're going. So San Felipe, Mexico is where we would go. But we wouldn't stay in town. We would stay out in the desert and we would dig a hole and we would just like, eat whatever. And then we would go into the town and go around and we didn't even, most of us speak very much Spanish, but we would go around and teach them that their religion was wrong and ours was right. I don't know why that was a particular place we needed to go save people, but the kids lived, they lived in dirt huts and things like that, but theirs were kept clean. They would sweep
Right.
them or whatever. And there was just a lot of kids in the streets, and maybe those kids weren't like, the family was fine if Americans came around, and maybe we, gave them bottles of pop or whatever and then
Yeah.
taught them about God. But it was a really strange existence because we would stay different places every single night
Yeah.
for the most part, and it could be anywhere.
I mean, unlike the Westboro Baptist Church,
Mm.
and I might be wrong about my impression, but it didn't seem too confrontational. It seemed like you guys are very good at inviting people in. You had like a circus with you. Did you really have like an elephant go with you guys? Is that
No, the elephant didn't go with us. We
Okay.
hired the
hire
elephant.
the elephant? Okay.
So we would do this circus was really the main circus. We did a lot of prepping for it,
Mhm.
but it was only one weekend a year. We made a
Oh, okay.
lot of money on the circus. I mean,
Circus
that's how
was-
not a lot of money by real terms,
Uh-huh.
but enough to support the organization. But we hired out what we needed to hire out, and then we played the parts that we could.
Okay.
But no, we didn't. That would have been really cool if we actually got to own an elephant. We had like a camel in the circus or other things too, and gave camel rides, but like it was all rented from whoever
wherever you happen to be that you needed it.
whoever rents elephants
Right.
and
The
camels
camel.
to crazy men who are running cults. I don't know.
I mean, one of the most surreal things is that Houdini 2,
Yeah.
the sequel to Houdini guy, was he a member of the field?
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was a member of the field.
Yeah, I grew up with him. I mean, he's older than I am, but
Yeah.
and he took himself very seriously. I think he really thought he was Houdini incarnate.
Wow.
And he looked a lot like him, and he would do all the same things, and he just kept upping the ante.
Wow.
Thank goodness he didn't get killed doing that, because he did a lot of really crazy stuff.
And you were in his illusions, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
because I was a little girl who was owned by the organization,
Right.
and we were the very first grandchildren of our grandfather, and he didn't allow children in the cult for a really long time. He had celibate men only, and so that because he did this for decades before I was born. So he started it in 1931 just with boys, and for decades it was only boys. And then he had a daughter in the 40s. So my mom was born in the 40s, and he still had an all male organization that she was part of. But then eventually, like when she wanted, she became an adult, and he didn't want her to marry on the outside. So my father had been one of his boys since he was 12 and grew up with the Field family. And so he married his daughter to him, and then they let in women and children for the first time because my mom started having babies. So it was brand new in the 70s,
It was
basically.
brand. I feel like there is a big emphasis on family, maybe large families with a lot of maybe other conservative Christian culture or groups. But that's interesting that at the onset it was more monastic and more about just men specifically.
Yeah.
And then the families were incorporated. Did you guys ever run into conflict when proselytizing? Like you said, you're in Mexico and they're Catholics there. Like, did people ever get angry about what you were preaching, or was it sort of?
We were taught to be conflict avoidant,
Uh-huh.
and I was taught completely that anytime an authority, first of all, you were taught to avoid authority at all
Right.
costs. You pretend that you need to use the bathroom, whatever, and then you always learn to get out the back door. I feel like that's a skill I've used my whole life too. Always getting away. But we were definitely taught, like if we were in a building, to say yes, 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 we're leaving, and then to go down to the next floor and then go seek help somewhere else, but we were taught to never talk to officers and to refuse. And I guess we were taught really the right of refusal to speak, but we weren't taught that that was an actual legal thing that we were allowed.
Oh,
But we
yeah.
were taught to never speak,
Right.
to just say, I cannot speak to you. I'm not allowed to speak to you, sir. And then to leave. And
Right.
and so unless a cop is gonna chase you through, I used to be in the streets of San Francisco and stuff, and just so we were really taught to avoid all conflict.
And if you're not giving your identity or really opening yourself up, is the idea when you're on the trip to recruit people or just for them to repent and believe in Jesus? What was
So
the
to this
goal?
day, I'm not 100% sure because they did donate to
Okay,
us. And
that's
so
smart.
I feel like we would go into churches and we would sing in the churches, not their songs, but
Right.
our songs.
Uh-huh.
And we went to, for example, we would go to a place like Gettysburg. Well, we go to Williamsburg and we would sing "Give Me Liberty" or "Give Me Death," in the whatever in Williamsburg, where they have the first House of Congress or whatever.
Right.
And so we would go and teach people that they were sinners and that this is the only true God. But then we never let them join us. I think we just, if they could repent and go to heaven, then they would give us money. And we had these little envelopes and they would put money in the envelopes. So I don't know. I wasn't trained that we were doing it to get money, but I think that we were doing it to get money.
To get money, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it seems like the point is to be very closed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just almost ironic. It's like you're trying to save people, but then also no one's allowed in the field.
Yeah, so the field never had a member that wasn't there by the age of 10, and most
Wow.
members joined at 5. So they were
Wow.
always raised and given what would you call it? I would call it brainwashing now,
Sure.
but indoctrination
Mhm.
at very young ages. So no one to this day who's ever gotten married at the field has ever gotten divorced.
Wow.
100%, no one's ever gotten divorced. The very first wedding was my parents' wedding.
Wow.
So that's what began
That's what
the
started it.
families. But nobody ever got divorced. Everyone's still married and it's still the same people. So I've met a lot of the kids who are younger than me. They're not kids anymore, but who came to my things, and I know their parents,
Yeah.
I don't know them anymore, but I knew them, and they would ask questions, but their parents have also turned their backs on them even to this day.
So the field is still going strong in a way, then.
Well, yes, my sister runs the school there. Elizabeth
wow.
does. And Elizabeth is very, very against this book. But some of the people who know her and send their kids there have asked me a lot of questions. And I think most people have come to the terms that she had a different childhood than I did. And so she's interpreted her worldview is just different for that.
Right.
Now, she would say the organization is completely different, that
Mm.
it is not mean anymore. They certainly don't teach people to survive. It's
Oh, okay.
become they used to be really against the YMCA because they became secular.
Oh,
So I
yeah.
think they're trying not to be too secular, but now they identify at least as Christian. When I was raised, we were not allowed to say we were Christian. We were not Christian, although we used the Christian Bible, but we were really separatists from that.
Oh, interesting.
So now I think they are, now they live a Bible based existence. They
Uh-huh.
have a private school that my sister runs, and it's still closed community, but not harsh the way that I was raised.
Is it in the same location?
hmm
Same area? Oh,
Yeah, they branched out to a different. They have the original field. I went down there to do research,
yeah.
and my mom, her service was held there last year, so I went
Oh,
down
okay.
to the actual field that I wrote about,
Oh.
and I was allowed to go because it's my mom and the people who the guy who was leading it. He is Thomas in the book,
Uh-huh.
and he even said to me, "Oh, I haven't talked to you since we were at Mimi's Cafe."
Oh.
Like like he remembered
Yeah.
that, and I was a significant figure because I'm somebody that they've taught people not to be.
Thomas took you to the color purple, right? Or
No, that
that-
was another young man who was my age. Thomas was older, and he used to drive us up. He was a leader there,
Oh yeah, okay. Okay.
but he took over the organization, so he's like the head leader
He's the
there.
head leader.
The
then.
boy who took me to the color purple was amazing. That I had that experience. He had left at that point, and I have had no further contact. And
Oh,
we
that was
talked
a
a
long
little
time
bit way back then,
Uh-huh.
but I have not heard from him. So
You
I don't know if
he's
he's read the book. I do
Okay.
not know. No,
Yeah, he seemed like a good influence.
he was. Yeah,
Encourage you to go to college and
Yeah.
So if I understand that correctly, then you left the field around 17,
hmm
and then you said you're a professor at 21. You were teaching
Mhm.
at 21. That's incredible. So, and this is not in the book. Really quickly, from 17 to 21, how just what was the process to become a teacher at that point?
Well, first of all, I went to a really unconventional school. I got married really young. Um, while I was still in college to a guy who's here right now listening to
okay.
this. And so he had been raised, he was a leader at the fields.
Okay.
And so I didn't know how to acclimate. I could not, it was really hard for me to know other people at college or whatever. So I ended up getting married because honestly, I just didn't know how to function in the world.
Mhm.
And but I did go to grad school straight from college, and I was really pretty well prepared to learn. I was so hungry for knowledge that all I did was a house cleaner still. All I did was house clean
Yeah.
and learn, just really devote myself. And then I got a full ride to grad school, and I got a TA position right when I got there, but then I got a full teaching position in another department as a writer in residence. And so I was teaching basically freshman composition when I was 21, and I had regular classes to myself. And then I was also a TA in the English department, in the modern novel class and stuff like that. And so I was in that PhD program, and then I just kept teaching. And so I got a tenure track position, had tenure by the time I was 30, and had a bunch of kids and did all of that. I mean, had all my kids before I was 30. So I was doing all of those things simultaneously. I was very driven.
Well, okay, and this is a question that I have to know on the basis of that. What was your earliest writing, and also when did you start thinking you'd be a writer? I guess off that chronology.
I think I did everything I could to avoid being a writer. I think I was a writer probably as a teenager when I was scribbling notes to everybody, but I didn't want to be a writer because I didn't think it was a secure way of life, and I had children young. I wrote a book when I was 25. I had publishers very interested in it. They wanted to publish it as nonfiction. It was some version of this, not the same book, but it was called Layaway. And I put it away, and I didn't write anything else. I just said, no, I'm teaching. I'm a mom. It's enough. I became a yoga teacher. And it wasn't until agents were just like, no, you have to write a book. I really resisted seeing myself as a writer. I said, no, I'm a teacher. And, I've been teaching. I teach creative nonfiction in the prisons. I teach I teach people to tell their story, but I just really resisted telling my own story.
Well, does anyone have a question about that or anything else?
I think, first of all, when people asked me where I came from, I really didn't know how to answer the question. And I found it was complicated. And even talking about now, I'm like, oh, yeah, no, well, yes, we had a circus, but yes, we proselytized. I don't know what I was doing. It really is confusing to me. I was raised with a lot of lies. I was raised not understanding where things came from. When I went and I did have funding in college, but then they also wanted to do financial aid, and we didn't have tax records, and I didn't have a social security number. And I did, it was a lot of stuff that was super embarrassing to me. I felt really inadequate. And then I felt like I wasn't able to get the story straight, and my parents wouldn't answer questions, and I didn't understand. I really truly felt confused. And then I just wanted to leave it all behind. And I kind of thought if I just moved on, I wouldn't have to think about it anymore. I think that's probably the strongest truth. There's probably also a part of me that just really felt like I wouldn't even know how to wrap my head around how to talk about it. And I also didn't think it would be particularly interesting to anyone because I thought that it would be like nobody lives like that. And so I didn't think there would be anything for people to attach to, like what, and everybody like it just feels to me a lot of people have like stories like, well, there's a lot of weird stuff happened to me. And unless you have a way of telling that, it just feels really confusing. And then here's another, probably this is the number one truth that I don't want to say, but I'll try it. I was taught not to talk about it.
Yeah.
I was really, truly taught that to talk about it was a sin, but it was like hellfire, brimstone, and also betrayal of my entire family. So we were taught it's not a cult, don't talk about, and just absolutely, yeah, I was taught not to talk about it. And my father cannot forgive me for, coming out with this book. I just think that neither can my sister. Now my younger two siblings do, but I mean they're very really supportive. But yeah, it's weird the way that you could still absorb that. Like even though you know that you don't have to listen to that anymore, you still feel like it's betrayal. Yeah. Great question. You got me to say an honest answer that it took me a moment to get to. I try to be honest with like sometimes like I don't know. That's such a interesting way to look at it.
Right. It's that follow-up question is like, how, with the nature of our society now, it seems like there's so much, I don't know if you would call it brainwashing, but just different ways of viewing the world. Like, how do you address that going through your own trauma? How do you view that through your own experience, through your childhood, I guess? I don't know.
So I'm comfortable with the word indoctrination, probably, and sometimes I do use the word brainwashing too, or the term brainwashing. Since I've written the book, I've had interesting people come out of the woodworks. There's a cult expert. He literally goes by the term cult expert. He was a Moonie and he left the Moonies, so he's an ex-Moonie. But since the 1970s, he has deprogrammed former cult members. I didn't even know that was a thing. It would have been super useful to me. He was doing it when I got out of the cult. Like he'd already like made. I had no idea. I think who would even know? If you know of anybody getting out of a cult, he's called the cult expert. And so he and I were on Megan Kelly's show together, which that was a weird thing to even do. But then he invited me on his show, and we did I think we did a really interesting show. It dropped sometime in July, so it's not out yet. But I learned a lot from just talking to someone who spent his life helping people deprogram beliefs that have not served them. And I think there's a lot of that that goes on. You're right, like it's all over the place, and um I try, like, even as a yoga teacher, like, I feel like one of the phrases you probably hear from a lot of yoga teachers is something like, well, take what you need, leave the rest behind, listen to your body, don't do anything that doesn't feel right to you. Take what I say as a suggestion, not a mandate, like nothing is required. If you want to do your own thing, whatever. Um, learn to breathe, learn to trust yourself. And it seems to me that that would be the way we would be going, and we're not like as a society, right?
We're going backwards.
Yes.
Very much so. And I guess, how is your view of God now? Like, do you believe still, not believe? Like, how does that work in your life?
Oh, first of all, I certainly don't believe in the God of my childhood. I don't believe in any sort of God. I don't believe in a Judeo-Christian God. I don't believe in any really like unified field force like as God. If they're I guess I identify as agnostic to the extent that I would never presume that I know truly. I mean, I know the science of how perhaps the world began, but like I don't know where the energy comes from. It feels to me that there is a lot of dark energy, for example, that we can't even measure, and then we find ways to measure, and then we're like, oh, look at that exists. And so I don't have the knowledge to know what sort of God could exist. But I'm certain that that God does not look like me, and that my version of interpreting God would not be relevant, I think, to anyone else's interpretation of God. That whatever spiritual energy I think exists that we can see as goodness, or we can see as like light and darkness, if we even want to use those terms, that there's things that feel expansive to us, and there's things that feel harsh or constrictive, and there's violence, and there's love, and that those feel like some form of energy that may come from some place, but that I could never begin to know what that is, and that I certainly am not going to try to impart that. My lack of knowledge, I'm not going to try to impart knowledge onto anyone else. Yeah. I carry a lot of grief, much of which I chose not to put in the book, partly because the book is really told from the perspective of a girl living it, not from the perspective I have now. But since you asked, I've been plagued by nightmares my entire adult life. I've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of energy healing. I've done a lot of cognitive therapy. I've done a lot of somatic therapies, and I still have nightmares. And
Wow.
there are still times, and it certainly comes up around my children too, is that sometimes I feel so heavy that I don't know what normal is, like that bothers me, sometimes that, and I see their freedom, or I have nieces. My younger sister Becca has daughters, and one of her daughters, who's 19, she took yoga teacher training from me, and it was so beautiful to have this experience with her. But she's so free in the world, and she was never burdened with religion, and she wasn't burdened with seeing her body as a negative thing, and she's just expressive. She has a really healthy body image and sexuality, and sometimes witnessing that, like, I get so warm and loving that she's had this experience, and sad that I didn't have that, and that I couldn't recreate it. Like, I wasn't able to later in life to ever find that kind of freedom. And so I think I do carry that grief, and the grief of having it be so difficult to connect with people, or like when I told the story of always escaping and knowing how to escape, like I just am triggered to run all the time. And so I don't, no amount of therapy as like gotten that away from me, like it feels very embedded. So I don't know what it'll be like at 78, but
I hate to cut it off at such a tender, intimate part of the conversation, but apparently we're out of time. I really want to thank you so much for coming out to Arvida
thank
and
you.
speaking to us. Thank you so
I
much,
really
Michelle.
appreciate your interview, and I really appreciate your questions.
Thank you,
Thank
Michelle.
you.